Alright, well today we're going to talk about the skin. We're going to have two separate lectures on the skin, and this is the first one. So here we go. So the skin is something we definitely take for granted. The skin is an absolutely incredible organ of the body. It's actually a set of organs that serve mostly protective functions, but also some other functions that we'll talk about. If you think about it, I mean, it's this incredible covering of the body that holds everything in place and protects everything so much more sensitive underneath it, and can withstand everything you pretty much put to it. Stretching, washing, it's waterproof, it heals itself automatically. If scientists could ever come up with anything close to this, then it would be a miracle. This is absolutely incredible tissue of the body. It's constantly regenerating itself, and it lasts your whole life. If you were to lay out the whole skin of an average sized person, it's about 2 meters square and weighs about 10 pounds. So this is actually a pretty large organ. So the functions of the skin, the first one we'll talk about is protection. Okay, and as we talk about protection, we'll talk about multiple barriers that the skin provides, and the first one we'll mention here is the physical barrier. Okay, so there's many layers of what's called keratin. Okay, keratin is a protein, and we'll talk a little bit more about how it comes about. But it can thicken when stress is applied, and this is over time. And this is what we get when we have a callus. We have stress applied to skin. In a certain area, it ends up becoming a callus with just a thickening and extra keratin protein. And so we're really just protecting from that friction that's caused, and protection from blisters and the skin separating. So that's part of the physical barrier. Another part of the physical barrier is are the sebaceous glands that we have. Okay, and sebaceous glands secrete oil and glycoproteins. Okay, and what this does is it causes the skin to be waterproof. And it's very important it's waterproof, not only that we don't allow water in, but also that we don't allow water out. Maintaining water balance is a major protective function of the skin. And then we also have another protein that's considered a pigment protein, which means it absorbs light, and it's called melanin. Okay, melanin, a very important protein that we find in the skin, and it protects against the sun. It's absorbing light. And protects against the energy from the sun destroying other parts of cells on the skin, and it absorbs that light so the other parts of the cells don't. And then we have hair, small little hair on the skin, and this protects against the sun, against abrasion, also against insects. When without hairs, most of the time we can't even actually feel insects on our skin, but with those hairs we can. So the next barrier that we're going to talk about is the chemical barrier. So the skin is always covered in bacteria. You just have bacteria all over your body all the time. And so the skin has these special secretions that make sure those bacteria don't don't divide too much and kind of take over. And so we have something on the skin called the acid mantle. There's a layer of secretions with a very low pH, and it stops the bacteria from multiplying. And then also part of the secretions are something we call defensins, which are very interesting little proteins that actually punch holes in bacteria and destroy them. And you can see those up here. This is a few different ways that defensins work. Literally just making a hole in their membranes. Also taking a chunk out here. Different ways that these defensin proteins work, but all in all, they're always destroying bacteria to make sure the bacteria don't get out of hand. And we also have a biological barrier in the skin, and these are immune cells that are found in the epidermis. One of the main immune cells we find there are the Langerhans cells, and the function of these is to conduct phagocytosis, destroy any bacteria or viruses or other funguses or other things like that that are going to try to invade the body through the skin, and also to start an immune response if there is some kind of a damage to the skin. And then we also have macrophages, but these are a little bit deeper, not in the epidermis but in the dermis. Okay. Um, Temperature regulation is very important in the body. Body temperature is sensed by the nervous system. If it's too hot, we get vasodilation of the blood vessels in the skin, and that causes us to sweat. Too cold, the opposite happens, vasoconstriction and no sweating, holding on to that as much heat as possible. Um, your body has constant heat production due to metabolism, so most of this temperature regulation function of the skin involves releasing heat. And yeah, and so uh, so a huge function of the skin is sweating. And like I've mentioned before, sweating is something very unique to humans. Humans do it the best, and it can range anywhere from a half a liter a day, even if you're not really doing much, all the way up to 12 liters a day in someone who's um, very very acclimated to heat and sweats a lot. And so that's up to 3 gallons of sweat a day. So lots and lots of sweat. So the skin is very important for regulating temperature. Another big function of the skin is sensation. Obviously, lots of touch receptors in the skin, epidermis and the dermis. We do have some pressure and pain receptors. These are only found deeper in the dermis layer. Then hair follicles. Like I mentioned before, we can sense insects walking on our skin because of these. We can also sense really light things like wind or any kind of movement on the skin. Um, Another main role of the skin is to help us make vitamin D. You have to have a certain spectrum of UV light to be able to carry out the necessary reactions to make vitamin D. So this is important for calcium absorption in the stomach, but it's also important for bone development. And so you can see with this picture here with this boy has rickets, is what it's called, and that's vitamin D deficiency, and you get bone degeneration and weak cartilage bones. Another main function of the skin is to be a reservoir for blood. The dermis holds about 5% of the blood, and you can see just these very dense blood vessels in the dermis down here. And this can be kind of saved here and sent other places when it's needed. The skin is also very important for excretion of chemicals and waste products. And so nitrogen is waste, similar to our urine. After the breakdown of protein, we have nitrogen waste, and that can be excreted through the skin. And also with sweating, we excrete some sodium chloride as well as obviously water. Okay, so the skin layers. Definitely going to need to know these different layers of the skin. There's really 2 main layers of the skin: the epidermis, which is epithelial tissue, just like we've been talking about so much in class. Okay, and then we have the dermis, okay, which is all connective tissue. All right, so just like you know about epithelial tissue, it's always has connective tissue underneath it. And then we have the hypodermis, which is not really a part of the skin, but it's also connective tissue. It's mostly fat and lots of blood vessels, as you can see down here. Okay, so now into the epidermis, we have a few different types of cells. So one important type of cell is called a keratinocyte, and the main function of these cells is to make the main tissue that is the epidermis, and they're going to be continually making new keratinocytes and moving their way up towards the surface. And literally millions of these cells rub off of our bodies each day. And a good chunk of the household dust that we have in our houses is actually dead skin cells. It's pretty gross when you think about it, but that's what it is. We get a complete new set of skin about every month, about every 25 to 45 days. And so the deepest layer of the keratinocytes, the layer that's closest to the dermis, is still alive, still fully functioning cells that are dividing and producing proteins. But as you move up closer to the surface, the cell organelles are actually slowly replaced with keratin, the protein, and so the ones on the top are not really alive cells anymore. They're just cells that are packed full of this protein, keratin, and they become this little hard cell. And they're all held together by desmosomes, those rivet-like cell junctions that we talked about early on in the class. Another important cell is a melanocyte, and these are found in the deepest layer of the epidermis only, so very close to the dermis, and these are the ones that actually make pigment, melanin, and they send it, and it goes into the keratinocytes. Okay, and the type and the amount of pigment that you make is what's going to dictate the color of the skin. And then, as we mentioned before, we have these Langerhans cells, which are immune cells that do phagocytosis. And then we also have Merkel cells, which are important for touch reception. These are nerve cells. Okay, and so this is just a diagram showing the different layers of the epidermis, and you can go through this in your book. It's figure 5.2, but we've got a few different layers here. The most superficial layer is called the stratum corneum, and that's mostly just the dead keratinocytes. Next layer is the stratum granulosum, which is 3 to 5 layers of flattened cells. The organelles are deteriorating and being filled with keratin, but they're not completely dead yet. And then the stratum spinosum, several layers of keratinocytes, and these are all held together by desmosomes, and they have thick bundles of pre-keratin, but they're still alive. And then the deepest layer is the stratum basal, and the stratum basal is where the actively dividing stem cells are that are making these new keratinocytes and sending them up to the surface. You'll need to know those different layers. And then what you see here under A, this is an example of a keratinocyte. Okay, the B, Langerhans cells, this is one of those immune cells, kind of looking around for invaders to catch and destroy. C is going to be the desmosomes. Okay, you can see these dark little circles that are actually helping to hold all those skin cells together. Okay, D is the melanin granule and a melanocyte. So this big gray one is a melanocyte. You can see out of all of these extensions that it makes those melanin proteins, sends them through its little extensions, and loads up these keratinocytes with that pigment to give the skin its color and give it protection from UV rays. And then E is a Merkel cell, and you can see it's connected to a neuron here, and that's for sensing pressure. So when there's pressure down on the top of the skin up here, this Merkel cell will sense that. Okay, and then underneath the epidermis is the dermis, and we find mostly collagen fibers here. Remember, this is connective tissue, but also some elastic and reticular fibers. Cells are mostly fibroblasts. Remember, those are the ones that are making all those protein fibers. And it has kind of a gel-like ground substance. The functions are support of the skin. It's very highly vascularized and innervated, so lots of blood, lots of neurons, lots of sensation, and it has some accessory structures that are important: hair follicles, sweat, oil, and glands. Okay, and then within the dermis, we have a couple different layers. The papillary layer. The papillary layer is areolar connective tissue, and it's called that because it has papilla. And the papilla are these right here, these little finger-like projections that stick up, and there's capillaries that kind of loop underneath these and go up into the tip of the papilla, which allows some blood flow to get actually into the epidermal layers without actually being in the epidermis, because the epidermis is epithelial tissue, so that it's not vascularized. So this is a nice design to get blood up close to these melanocytes and keratinocytes without actually having blood in that layer. And then we have dermal ridges, which are even thickenings of underneath the papilla. These are what give us traction, like a tread on the bottom of our feet, as well as fingerprints shown here. Okay, and then we have the reticular layer in the dermis. That's the lowest layer. So you can see this is a microscope view of the epidermis here, and you can see the papilla of the dermis coming up into the epidermis. And then this is the papillary layer that we just mentioned. And then below that is reticular layer, which is going to be 80% of the thickness of the dermis. So this is most of the dermis, and this is what gives the skin its strength, stretch, and flexibility. And this is mostly very thick collagen bundles. Okay, and then finally we've got a little differentiation here between two types of skin. Most of the skin we find in our body is considered thin skin, and this is pretty much found everywhere else, and this is the only place you'll find hair follicles. Okay, and thin skin is shown here. It's those same layers we talked about: stratum corneum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, stratum basal, and then we have the dermis. Okay, but certain areas, like on the bottom of our feet and on the palms of our hands, we have thick skin. One unique thing about that is we find a new layer in there called the strata lucidum, and it's only found here, and that's shown right here. So that's kind of almost a clear-like layer in the epidermis. It adds some thickness. All of the epidermal layers that you find in thin skin are thicker in thick skin. The papilla are larger. You can see you can kind of make out the papilla here a little bit in the thin skin, but in the thick skin, very large papilla sticking up. And this is where you find epidermal ridges that make those treads in the fingerprints that we talked about. And this is where you're going to find calluses. So much longer turnover time, more desmosomes, and much thicker skin. And I think that will do it. That's the end of our TBL Day 2 lecture. So study hard for your quizzes on Monday.